So with my presentation today, I want to look a little bit at the historical context for this broader conversation that we're having with this symposium. And so in particular, I want to talk a little bit about the historical context for why the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe does not have federal recognition today. As the chairwoman mentioned, there are some very kind of current politics, but there are some other factors that go back over the past 250 years. And really talk about why tribes like Muwekma are at a particular disadvantage when it comes to federal recognition. But I also want to talk about why that's wrong. So it's erasure and resistance, and about why, if we take a long-term view, some of the determinations made by the Bureau of Indian Affairs are just incorrect. And this kind of gets to what the chairwoman was talking about, and we'll hear from other speakers later when we talk about kind of the nitty-gritty of the case of looking particularly at the years between the late 1920s and the early 1980s, and why, if you look at the fuller context, a different picture emerges. So I want to start first with erasure. So kind of thinking, what are the different factors that make federal recognition so challenging in California, and why is our federal recognition process broken in the state, or for tribes that share their geography with the state of California? So what's this historical context? And so in many ways it starts with places like Santa Clara. And if you look at the patterns of federal recognition today in California, I made this map for an article I was writing over a decade ago, and really nothing's changed. And the pattern that you see is that all the little dots are federally recognized tribes. And so there's 110 federally recognized American Indian tribes that share their geography with the state of California today. There's 574 in the entire nation. And what that means is we have just a little under 20% of all the tribes in the entire country are here in California. So you don't often think maybe of California as Indian country, but it really is. But when you look at the distribution, the geographic distribution of those tribes here in the state, you'll notice something. And in this graphic, I've overlaid the dots represent individual tribes, and the dark kind of line is the limits of the Spanish mission system, of the Franciscan mission system. And then the shaded area is later anthropologists' estimates of native population in the early 20th century. But the really stark pattern is, when you look at the dark line, there's not very many tribes within that on the coast, right? And this is illustrating that tribes whose ancestors were in the Franciscan missions are at a disadvantage for federal recognition today for a number of reasons, which I'll discuss. The exceptions to that are down in San Diego County. There's a lot of tribes associated with Mission San Diego and Mission San Luis Rey, whose ancestors didn't face the full brunt of missionization the way that people did here in the Bay Area or the Central Coast. And for that reason, many of their descendants today are recognized by the federal government. And you'll notice, other than those tribes down south, there's really only two. There's a Santa Ynez Band of Chumash in the Channel Islands region near Santa Barbara, and then there's the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria, which only had their federal status restored by an act of Congress in the year of 2000. So otherwise, along the coast, there just aren't federally recognized tribes, due in large part to what happened at places like Santa Clara. And there's a quote here from Alfred Kroeber, and those of you who are not anthropologists, Alfred Kroeber was kind of the grandfather of anthropology here in the state of California. And he and his students went out in the early 20th century and studied tribes, and particularly focused on communities who had elders who could remember a time before the gold rush. And they, as I'll talk about, neglected the tribes in their own backyard. He was a professor at Berkeley, started the anthropology PhD program there in the early 20th century, and neglected tribes like Muwekma, who were literally in their own backyard and were connected in other ways. But when they looked around in the early 20th century, these early anthropologists, many of them, what they saw along the coast were tribes who spoke Spanish, who maybe lived in urban areas, who practiced agriculture, and in many cases had the Catholic faith. And so to these anthropologists, they did not make up what they expected California Indian people to look like, and they were ignored for that reason. And similar things happened within the federal government. And these two processes built on each other in a synergistic effect that's left us with this pattern today, which is a pattern of erasure. So let's just briefly look at why the government and anthropologists both bought into this. Why was this a prevalent interpretation in the early 20th century here in California. And part of it, again, has to do with what happened at the missions. So here in the Bay Area, like other regions in California before Europeans arrived, tribal people lived in relatively small communities, spread out across the landscape into many independent nations, each with their own leadership and defined territory. And these tribes in many cases moved within their territories at different times of year to map onto different resources that were coming into season. From the point of view of the Spanish, this was totally untenable. It was very hard to govern people that moved around, very hard to govern dozens and dozens of small polities. And so the missions, in part, were, of course, to spread the Catholic faith, but also from the point of view of the Spanish crown, it was really to bring people in, to literally reduce and congregate them so that they could be more easily governed, and kind of to turn Native people here in the state into essentially a peasantry like existed in Spain at the time. And so what you see within a generation, at least in the southern part of the Bay Area where we are, and kind of the core Ohlone speaking territories, in 1775, a year before the first missions were founded here in the Bay Area, there were literally dozens of independent tribes. Within a generation, there were a handful of missions: Santa Clara, San Jose, San Francisco, and of course San Juan Bautista and Santa Cruz to the south. And the quote there is by Randall Milliken, who is an anthropologist who studied this phenomenon and really kind of was one of the first to dig into the mission records. And his interpretation, like other anthropologists before him, was that this was a one-way process, that once you stopped seeing the names of particular villages or tribes in the mission baptismal records, that those tribes ceased to exist. And so you get quotes like this, which I think is factually incorrect. But this is, part of that conventional wisdom. Things did not get better. When the mission started shutting down in the 1830s and 40s, Mexican elites, many of whom were retired soldiers, other folks who had been here in California and had always kind of resented the amount of land that the missions held, sought to get that land. And from the point of view of the Franciscans, even though we'll talk about some of the challenging aspects of missionization, they believed they were holding the land in trust for Native people. But the politics of erasure started very quickly in terms of local elites wanting that land, seeing the wealth that land represented. And so in Santa Clara County alone, by the mid-1840s, more than 55,000 acres had been gobbled up of former mission lands, had been gobbled up by elites. And the same thing happened in Alameda County and San Mateo County and basically every county where there had been missions, all up and down the state. And less than a decade later, when the Americans came in, most of these lands were basically stolen. The lands that the Mexican elites had stolen from Native people were, again, stolen by Americans coming in. And so land has been kind of a crucial factor throughout. Native people had to abandon their territories to join the missions, and then those lands that they thought were being held for them were, in most cases, stolen from them again. The other side of this coin, of course, is just the effects on people themselves. I put that Sherburne Cook quote at the bottom. A very marked decline in numbers is kind of the understatement of the century. The missions, in short, were disastrous for Native people. The loss of life is just almost incalculable. And you can see in this chart, the dark bars are births, and the lighter bars are burials. And you can see in every year, burials by far outpaced births. And so the missions were not reproductively viable, and most people that entered the missions faced drastically reduced life opportunities, and children that were born in the missions had an average lifespan of only 3 years. So really, tragic circumstances, of course. And just like with land, this did not get better. As the chairwoman mentioned, when the Americans came in, it was really an out-and-out genocide against Native people. And here in California, this was, literally supported by the state government, and the federal government reimbursed the state government for its expenses in outfitting militias that would go out and just really massacre Native people up and down the state. And I think, for us here at Santa Clara, we have the mission, of course, and that's important to think about, but we're tied into this other tragedy as well. And so Peter Burnett was the first American governor of California, and he has this awful quote from one of his first State of the State addresses. Maybe you've caught Gavin Newsom on NPR giving the State of the State. Well, this was, 170 years before, and he's basically advocating for genocide. But one of the things that we learned through the Ohlone History Working Group process over the last several years was that Peter Burnett was on the first board of trustees here at Santa Clara College. And so just thinking about how these events of the past are implicated in all of our institutions here in California, it runs deep. For later anthropologists and government officials, the challenges of the mission period, of the early American period, were, when they were looking at tribes in California, trying to figure out who to allot land to, and these types of questions, they relied very heavily on census records. There's different officials in the early 20th century went out and tried to record communities that were in place on the ground. And I've looked at some of those records, and our other speakers, Alan and Les, and of course folks from the tribe have looked at these records. And a lot of times it's clear that they didn't really go on the ground. They didn't really go and visit communities because they relied on census records to enumerate people. But the census records are chock full of errors. And especially for the kind of decades of the second, or the kind of mid-decades of the second half of the 19th century, 1860s, 70s, and 80s, the U.S. federal censuses are almost, meaningless in terms of true calculations of Native people. And so for some of my research, I was looking at Santa Clara County, of course. We're here in Santa Clara County. I wanted to understand what happened to Native people leaving places like Mission Santa Clara, but also Alameda County. Mission San Jose is just in the very far southern portion of Alameda County. And of course, as we'll talk about some of the other speakers, the Mission San Jose and Mission Santa Clara were very closely tied together in terms of their Native populations. Moving back and forth between those missions had a lot of familial ties. So I was trying to understand what happened to folks who had been in these missions and where did they go in the 19th century. And what I found was kind of shocking. So in Santa Clara County, in the federal census from 1860, there's 157 people listed as, Indians. And that's obviously an undercount. But in 1870, just a decade later, there's only 12. And there's just no way that that's possible, right? It's just not, it just is an inaccurate count. Alameda County, 1860, there's 131, also almost certainly an undercount. But in 1870, there's 114. Seems like, okay, well, that could be possible. I went through and double-checked every single one of those individuals. Nobody from the 1860 census listed as Indian appears in the 1870s. It's a completely different set of people. And so that just kind of speaks to the challenges for anthropologists or for government officials of understanding, how big these communities were, where they were, and that. But from the point of view of Native people, you can understand why this happened. On the one hand, census enumerators are, for people that do this type of historical research, it's not just Native people that they skipped. There's a lot of great work on the Chinatowns here in the Bay Area, and census enumerators, skipped other forms of marginalized communities as well. They just weren't interested. But for Native people, there was also a vested interest in not revealing your identity, right? In that period of genocide, it was very dangerous to be an Indian person, a Native person in California. There were literally bounties on people's heads in parts of the state. And so, there's this kind of often repeated quote that says, it was better to be a hated Mexican, because of course there was prejudice against people from what's today Mexico and other Latin American countries, but it was better to be a hated Mexican than a dead Indian. So people hid their Native identities. Of course, it was, within their communities, they were able to be open about their heritage, but from the point of view of the kind of settler population moving in, Native people realized they had to kind of pull back. And so that made it very difficult, especially in a place like the Bay Area where there was this huge influx due to the gold rush and this kind of the urbanization for these communities to be visible to outsiders who weren't particularly interested in looking for them in the first place.